Hello, dear friends. The conflict in Ukraine is impacting lives both in Asia, in Europe, in different ways. We don't know where is the truth amid these claims and counterclaims by both sides. So, to get a little bit of clarity and to gauge the mood in Europe, we are joined today by Professor Glenn Diesen from the University of Southeastern Norway. He keeps a very close eye on Russia, knows Russia, that Eurasian region. So, welcome, Professor Diesen.
Thank you for having me on.
Okay, so let's kick off the conversation by the very simple question as to what is the truth of these claims by the US side, US, Europe, and the counterclaims by Russia on how the conflict is going on right now?
Well, the narratives were quite split. That is, the West or NATO kept saying, we're winning or Ukraine's winning, and Russia says the opposite. But I think the narrative has shifted now more in the West, where there's a growing recognition that Ukraine has effectively lost this war. It's at the end of the day, the numbers that have been thrown out simply didn't make sense, because I think about 80 to 85% of all casualties are caused by artillery, and the Russians dominate artillery often, 7-1 or 10-1. So it just made sense that because this is a war of attrition where you exhaust the adversary. So it just made sense that it was the Ukrainians who were suffering terribly. In addition, the Russians kind of control the sky as well in terms of air power, its fighters, its gliding bombs, missiles, drones. So it made sense that Russia enjoys a high or favorable attrition rate. Some say up to 1-7 or 1-8. In other words, every Ukrainian, every one Russian who gets injured or killed, you have 7 or 8 on the Ukrainian side. Now, I have no way of confirming these numbers, but based on the weapon superiority, it makes sense. Also, as the Ukrainians currently are storming Russian fortified lines, and they're not able to make much of a breakthrough.
Okay, I mean, that's claims, counterclaims aside, there's a larger dimension to the entire issue, and that is the impact of this conflict on Europe in general. And you just talked about probably the Ukrainians, a lot of Ukrainians are suffering, but are Europeans also suffering as a result of this war? What has been the impact on lives in general of this conflict?
Well, the impact has been first in the security sphere. This is quite dramatic because after the Cold War, we decided, first we had disagreements with Russia. We would create a common inclusive European security architecture, but then we began to abandon it because the Russians were weak. So we were able to expand all the way towards the Russian borders, and then effectively creating a Europe without Russia, collective hegemony on the West. This is what's at stake, and this is what's been falling apart. So this is quite dramatic. But in terms of the pain we're feeling directly from it, it's primarily economic, as the goal in the West was we were going to put all the sanctions on Russia, and ideally they would collapse before the end of the week, because the sanctions were so severe. We took the money from their central bank, froze all transactions, we kicked them out of SWIFT. So it was quite strict, and cutting their supply chains. But as it turned out, it didn't really work. And then, of course, with the attack on Nord Stream pipelines, either Americans or the Ukrainians, it further exacerbated the economic pain to Europe, because the Russians are able to diversify. They can send their energy to the east. Europe is not. So in Germany especially, you have these energy-intensive industries which no longer can compete, because now that the Russian gas is gone, the Americans step in and say you can buy our liquid natural gas instead. However, it's much more expensive, which is a drain, and that makes the industries less competitive, which means that they're all failing. And to make matter worse, the US has this initiative to counter inflation. So they give subsidies, which then the failing German companies are then incentivized to go over to the United States. So Europe is being deindustrialized. Just to get a very good example would be that the French economic minister at the beginning of the war said, we're going to use these sanctions to destroy the Russian economy and bring the country to its knees. And now that same economic minister is saying that America is deindustrializing Europe, that this is becoming an existential threat. So it has boomeranged, and it's a very hard times coming for us here in Europe.
So why is it just the French who are talking about this negative, the fallout of the conflict? Because I have also heard and read about the French President Emmanuel Macron, who is emphasizing the need of strategic autonomy for Europe. He's asking the European Union member countries not to tag along what he called in a couple of interviews as the external wars, that why should the Europeans be seen as just tag along countries as far as the US initiated wars is concerned?
Well, the problem with Macron, he tends to flip a lot, and he's a little bit all over the place because initially he's been one of the hardest on pushing for European strategic autonomy and what he calls European sovereignty. However, if you want to achieve strategic autonomy and sovereignty, you have to be able to diversify your partnerships. So when the conflict begins, Macron puts all his eggs in the American basket. So they join all the sanctions. The Americans says, cut yourself off Russian energy. The French follow. Now they're saying, you have to cut yourself off China. And the Europeans are following along this as well. Well, what's going to happen now is Europe has only one economic partner left, and that would be the United States. And this makes us excessively dependent on the United States. And if you have this asymmetrical interdependence where the Europeans are very dependent on the US is less dependent on Europe, this asymmetries can be converted into political influence. So this is why when Macron, he used to warn about Europe becoming vassals of the United States, if we're not already vassals, but at the same time, he's pursuing policies which enables this. So Europe is now severely weakened and increasingly beholden to the United States. So he talks a lot, but he doesn't necessarily push any specific policies in that direction.
Yeah, but leave alone Macron. Has this adverse impact on Europe, on the lives of people, generated any critical debate on the entire issue? Because it's not just about Russia, it's also about China. And in both issues, most European countries have just tagged along. So has this generated any internal critical thinking as to why, for how long can the European countries afford to do so?
Well, this is the problem, because our dominant ideology which is being pushed is that this is a conflict between liberal democracies and authoritarian states. So the ideology demands that we show solidarity, effectively organizing ourselves under US leadership and stick together on these policies pushing against Russia, China, all these other countries. However, a national interest does not correspond with this anymore, because our national interest will be to diversify our ties, connect closer with Russia, connect closer with China, also the United States, of course, and then avoid this excessive dependence on any one state or region. This is how you become autonomous and independent. But we're doing exactly the opposite. So I think it's very hard, because if anyone speaks against the dominant narrative, the solidarity and loyalties will be questioned. So we see that the existing elites do not question it, but in the horrible policies they're producing, a vacuum is created. We're seeing new political forces rising. If you look in Germany, for example, the Alternative for Germany, or AfD, they're polled as the second largest political party. The Germans don't know what to do. They're openly discussing now banning the second largest party in Germany, at least in the polls, simply because it's not possible to stay democratic and follow these policies at the same time, because there's a lot of self-harm going on.
Mm-hmm. But do you see this sentiment now spiraling into a mass movement in many European countries, where the common people, we read and we hear are feeling the pinch of all these wars, whether it was Afghanistan, Iraq, sanctions on China, or now the conflict with Russia?
Yeah, well, the commonality in all this conflict is there's always the media saying, we're winning, because if you say this, you convince the public, then you're able to mobilize public support for the policies to endure. But every time, it shows that, well, actually, they weren't winning in Afghanistan, they weren't winning in Iraq, we're not winning in Ukraine. So after a while, you can only fool people for so long. Once it becomes evident and the narrative begins to collapse, reality will kick in. So, and I feel like it seems we're currently moving in that direction, because I see more and more recognition now in the media that the war has not gone as we want. Because for a long time we kept saying, we're winning. At the same time, we keep escalating because we're looking for this wonder weapon to change the tide of the war. However, why would you have to change the tide of the war if we're winning? So the narrative ran into a brick wall. So I think this is creating more dissent now. So more protest on the streets, more political voices suddenly appearing, and also in the media, of course. Suddenly everyone was walking lockstep, but now we see a little bit more dissent coming along, and people openly speaking about how to end the war, which is, I guess, it should be considered a positive development.
Are you suggesting that, so to say, the time is on the side of Russia? Russia can afford to wait a little more and continue fighting despite the Western sanctions on it?
Well, that is what's happening. Every day, Ukraine is becoming more depleted. NATO has already very openly said, even NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg said, we're running out of weapons. Biden's confirmed the same. That's the reason why we're sending ammunition with depleted uranium, cluster ammunition, illegal weapons, because in Biden's words, we don't have anything else. And we haven't ramped up production sufficiently to make any big changes. So this is why we're also escalating with more long-distance weapons and such. But on the Russian side, you see the opposite. They have increased their production dramatically, and also I suspect they're getting some foreign assistance. In addition, the Russians has mobilized their army to a huge extent. Keep in mind, when they began this war, they thought that they were going to be able to just come in with about 150,000 troops. Within the first couple of days, they would pressure the Ukrainians to sit down and sign the agreements which they wanted, which would resolve the conflict. However, as we learned in the first week of the conflict, yes, the Ukrainians did want to sit down. They were willing to discuss giving up NATO membership and remaining neutral. However, the Americans and British stepped in and said, no, we will not accept this. However, if we'll continue to give you weapons if you'll fight the Russians. And since then, Russia had to convert its army from 150,000 to put pressure on Ukraine to an actual occupation force. So now we see hundreds of thousands of Russians being mobilized, armed to the teeth. So you see the Russians getting stronger on one side and NATO and Ukraine on the other getting weaker. So I would say, the time is on Russia's side, which is why you'll probably soon hear more from the West, especially the Europeans, calling for a ceasefire. It will be portrayed as a way of ending the war, but I think the Russians will suspect that this is merely to buy time to get more weapons, rearm Ukraine, so we can fight another day.
I was going through some of your writings and commentary on your recent paper. This also relates to the Ukraine war and the global European perspective. You think that China is striving for geo-economic leadership, wants to replace the US as the leader, while Russia endeavors to reposition itself from the dual periphery of Europe and Asia to the center of grand Eurasian geo-economic constellation. Do you think this can happen or is already happening in the face of extremely stiff resistance and sanctions regime by the US-led West?
Well, that's to a large extent what this war is all about. It's about world order. the West, especially the United States, trying to preserve unipolarity, while much of the rest of the world, especially China and Russia, are pushing for a multipolar system. However, I wouldn't say that the Chinese would aim to replace the Americans, because the Americans are pursuing a hegemonic strategy, which means they will have to dominate. To dominate, you need to sow divisions among other countries. So you split the Russians from the Chinese, the Russians from the Indians from the Iranians, and the Turks from the Russians. This is how you divide and conquer. It's a old tactic of any imperialist nation. But this is the problem of pursuing hegemony. You can't allow other countries to diversify. That's why they've also been pushing Germany to cut away from Russia for many, many years. But the Chinese are doing something very different. They're committed to multipolarity, but they want to be, what they say, first among equals. That is the leading state. Russia has accepted this. They say, yes, they are the largest economy. However, Russia don't want to see a dominant China. And the difference would be if China can dictate. Now, how you overcome this is to diversify your relations, which is why the Russians are very eager to reach out to India, Pakistan, Iran, other countries across Eurasia. And again, because Chinese aren't pursuing hegemony, they haven't opposed it. And this is, so you have now the Russians are doing this to have a Eurasia with many centers of power. So for the Russians, this is actually quite welcoming, because in the West, we always assumed that Russia and China would have a conflict over Central Asia because they would compete for dominance. But they're not doing this. This is what we do in the West. When we go into Central Asia or Ukraine, wherever, we always try to decouple that region from Russia to cause divisions, splits. But the Chinese, when they went into Central Asia, they say, we have interests here. Russia, you have interests there. Let's try to harmonize this interest. So you have then the Belt and Road Initiative trying to harmonize with the Eurasian Economic Union. And we're doing this under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And this is how it's being done. So this is very different from what Russia's used to when it deals with the West, where everything tends to be zero-sum. So I think that multipolar system has already arrived. The problem is the US is not letting go of a unipolar system, even though the multipolar realities have already arrived. That's very evident by the fact we're not able to defeat the Russians.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that the multipolar world has arrived. The unipolarity of the United States is under extreme stress because of the shrinking resources, as well as greater synergy among countries outside Europe, that is in Asia, Africa, with Chinese footprint almost all over, and then the Russian diversification of energy supplies. So let's see, it will be interesting to see how this multipolarity then eventually impacts, and whether it helps Russia come out of the shadows of this war and again regain its financial strength the way it had, and whether China can really assert itself. And this seems to be, as you said, a continued contest between geopolitics through intervention and geoeconomics through financial economic cooperation. So we have two clear blocks. This very interesting conversation, Professor Glenn Diesen. Thank you very much. And we hope to reconnect with you sometime very soon to follow up on the thoughts that we have just discussed. Thank you very much.